They call the Big Island the Orchid Isle, and for good reason too. We have orchids all over the place. It's a little bit bizarre because I don't really think there was any native species of orchid here on this island originally. Almost all orchids have been brought here by humans. Many of them have gone completely at home. They just love it here. There's a few that went wild and created weedy messes, like the cane orchids and so on, that just spread all over. But most of them have been really well-behaved visitors with a lot of aloha. This little guy right here, this is a Cattleya orchid. Cattleya's like it here in Mountain View. Ellen does very well with them. The orchids on this place are predominantly Ellen's project, and she has fastened them into almost every tree on this property. This little Cattleya right here, it's too bad this isn't smell-o-vision, because wow, it's so sweet and so spicy. It just fills the air here. The plant seems to bloom maybe a couple of times a year for us. Sadly, this spider orchid in our orange tree has gone out of bloom lately. It has fabulous spidery looking blooms on it. There are some new shoots coming over here, but there's nothing with a flower yet. This is one of the older orchids that's been around the farm for a while. I believe it was fastened into this tree, probably maybe 8 years ago. You can see here how the roots just wrap into the tree, and the moss covers it and so on. Here's another one over here. That's one of Akasuka orchids oncidiums. She's placed in here. So right here is one of the older oncidiums around, fastened into a Kona coffee plant. I never know where I'm going to find orchids around here, because Ellen kind of walks around and just hooks them on everything. The colors when they go into bloom are really just so exciting. Here's another example of a Cattleya that's currently not blooming, but it's obviously been here for a little while. The plant is really well rooted onto the trunk of this mountain apple. You can see right here how well attached. To get these on, what she does is first takes the orchid out of the container, shakes the medium off the bottom of it, and then you can see here she's using some green vine tie that tied the plant to the tree. Once it gets there and it's happy, then it turns around and it just roots right into the tree trunk. Right here, from the looks of how tight some of this is, I'd say that this has been on here for a while. The plastic's starting to distort. Here's a little more recent attachment. In this case, it appears she's taken one orchid, I believe, and broken it down into several pieces here, and then just spread it up and down this coffee tree. There's little bits of it all over the place here. Orchids like this Vanda are perfectly happy dangling in space. This guy's just got a little wire hook on him here, and he's just hung up over here on this mango tree, right there. There it is, right there. See that little ball? That's a little bag of fertilizer, and so when it rains, a little bit of fertilizer comes out, washes onto these roots, and keeps this guy growing. It sort of helps with him if a little bit of liquid stuff's put on every once in a while too. But I mean, no medium, no nothing. This thing just hangs in space. These orchids right here are a ground orchid. That's an epidendron. They will grow in a tree. They'll grow on a rock wall. They'll grow upside down, hanging off the roof, and they'll also grow right out in the garden. They ramble all over the place. This thing is almost weedy. It does a really good job of naturalizing around here. They come in a variety of colors. I believe Ellen's got some lavenders, some pinks, there might be a white, and then this red is the oldest and the most precocious of the bunch here. Here's another set of Vandas. They're on a koa stick, and they're hanging in an angel trumpet over here, Brugmansia. And see, this stick is just kind of fastened in here enough to keep the wind from making it swing. The orchids are placed directly on the stick. They just begin to root onto it. There's another one here has been placed directly on the trunk. Down here, though, again, back to smell-o-vision. This is the Oncidium Sherry Baby. Sherry Baby smells vanilla-like, I guess is what I'd call it. Anyway, it's got wonderful sweet perfume. The air here is just full of it this morning. Sherry Baby's been there for a while, stuck on the crotch of an old angel trumpet tree. That little guy right there, growing under Song India, is an Oncidium Tom Paisley. That orchid is adapted to Mountain View, Hawaii, almost as if it was native here. It really does well in this environment. Next to it here in the planter, we have some coconut orchids. Cute little guys. They grow on coconut tree trunks. That one has a little tiny brown flower that's really neat. Another real dainty little guy. This one has gotten spread around the place, growing on tree trunks, but the original plant is sitting here in a bucket. This one right here is a favorite of mine. It's growing in a large native hibiscus. This is the Viamia white hibiscus, native to Hawaii. It's been up here in this tree for, probably over 10 years. The orchid must have gotten itself out to about 20 or 30 pounds, and it broke down in a storm recently. And so I helped Ellen split it down to about half its size. We divided it, and then I went ahead and I tied it back into the tree trunk over here so it can re-secure itself. When this gets going, it has these awesome autumn-colored gold and oncidium blooms. The sprays get numerous and they become very long, and they'll stick up out of this tree so we can see them around the hibiscus. Just a wonder. Looks like the tag's faded on these already. But this one here, at least, looks like Dendrobium nobile. I'm not sure what the other one is. They're growing on a betel nut palm, and you can see how nicely the roots attach to the trunk. There's another interesting one. I'm not even sure what the genus and species on this thing is. She's not around, so I can't ask her. And I think the tag has faded again, too. Anyway, this one is fastened to an ohia tree right along the side of our driveway. You got another little bit of something right there too. Of course, when it comes to orchids in trees, this one right here is my favorite. We're looking at a Kona coffee tree, but it has scrambling through it the vine for the vanilla orchid. Vanilla orchid is definitely my favorite orchid. Right here, you'll see that there's some beans hanging in the thing. These have to be hand pollinated. There are no insects anywhere in Hawaii that can pollinate a vanilla orchid, so you got to do it by hand. Other than that, though, it's an easy grow. These things put on probably 6 foot in 6 months, and they do not require any soil. The vine, in this case, is just attached to the trunk of the coffee. Right here, a brand new vanilla orchid that I stuck into an avocado tree. It's fastening already. That was only put up there a few months ago. To get these going, I ordinarily will take a pot full of coconut core and set the cutting in it, set it on the ground over here, and then put the cutting up against the tree trunk right there. Once it attaches, we can remove the pot. Well, you folks who live here in Hawaii or South Florida or perhaps any other place in the world where it's warm, tropical, humid, and can grow orchids by hooking them to tree trunks like I just showed, then you got it made. Maybe I give you a few ideas. If you're living up high here, like I am in Mountain View above 1,500 feet, I would consider using orchids like Oncidiums, Dendrobiums, Dendrobium nobiles, Cymbidiums work well. They say they're not supposed to grow well here, but we do okay with Cattleyas, so, whatever. The one I haven't done well with at all is the Phalaenopsis, the moth orchid, which is one of the most popular potted orchids. That one doesn't like the water here. But for the rest of you living anywhere else, you're going to have to grow your orchids in pots like this one. And we do plenty of that too. Right over here is an entire table full of orchids in the nursery. It's living right here under the edge of my lime tree. We have many different varieties of orchids in combination here. There's everything from Oncidiums to Cattleyas. Oh, look, here's a Cattleya. making some nice fat buds right there. Almost all of these orchids are growing in pots, and they're growing in pots using a medium that is either coconut coir, or I'm also using fir bark. As of late, we have switched to fir bark. Ben down the road here is an orchid breeder just across the way, and he likes to use fir bark, and so Ellen decided that she was going to go with the professional on that. I've been using coconut coir because it was easier to get and cheaper, but apparently it doesn't work quite as well. What you use as a container for an orchid, not important. Right here you'll see we've got a little oncidium that's growing in a cacao pod. That's one of the cupuaçu pods, hard, woody. Like I say, the kind of container you're using really doesn't matter. Right here we've got a colander. The colander is filled up with fir bark chunks. Most orchids will grow fine in a bark medium. It's what I suggest for most people, especially living in the mainland. Here in Hawaii, we traditionally have used hapu'u, that's a tree fern trunk, but I don't really agree with slaughtering the tree ferns just to get that medium, so that's not a great idea. As I said, I've been using coconut coir, and it will work, especially if you get the washed stuff. Some of it has salts from seawater in it. You gotta make sure you're getting the right coconut coir. But in general, tree bark is a really good choice, since the orchids like growing on trees. This one right here isn't fir, actually. This is Monterey pine bark from New Zealand. So here's a good orchid substrata. Now, the grade is the issue, and how to figure out what grade you're using. Well, it depends. If you have fine rooted orchids, a fine grade chunk of bark is good. If you have coarse rooted orchids, large, heavy roots, a large chunk of bark works fine. Most orchids are going to work just fine in this medium grade that I've got in my hand right here. You know, and when in doubt, just go with a mid grade. But you can kind of tell by how big the roots are as far as what size chunk to use. You do want to be replacing this bark about once a year, typically after the orchid goes out of bloom. The bark is really just for the orchid to hold itself upright in the pot. It'll hold a little water, it'll hold a little nutrients, but the problem is that after a year it breaks down and it begins to hold too much water. So your orchid will die in the pot. The roots will begin to rot. If you don't shake off the old bark, take some brand new stuff and put it back in there. Don't be afraid. That is really the biggest way anybody will ever lose an orchid, is by being afraid to transplant it. They need it once a year if you got them in pots. So next to the rose, the orchid is probably becoming one of America's most popular flowers. It's kind of a crazy thing because most of us can't grow them outside of a greenhouse or outside of a house, but they do make pretty good house plants. A lot of orchids have now been bred so that they will grow very well in indoor conditions. Got to have your flowers, man. I mean, I hear too many people going, oh, no, I don't want any flowers. All I'm interested in is growing food. Well, I'll tell you what, the flowers draw the pollinators. The flowers are the food for your mind. I can smell the orchids right now running across my nose, okay? This is like, you're missing something if you're not including the flowers in your plan in the garden. As I say, here in Hawaii, it's the orchid aisle. You can have orchids all over hanging on the trees and stuff. For the rest of you, well, you're going to have to grow them in your greenhouse, or you're going to have to grow them on the windowsill. But they are really cool. And I mean, orchids just attach to us. You have to watch it. I had to go through an orchid 12-step program because when I was selling them, I wanted to bring them home all the time. When new orchids showed up, I'd be taking them home and bringing them to the house. I walked away from it. That's why orchids are now Ellen's job. Anyway, so there's just a brief look at the world of orchids here in Hawaii and a little bit of information for everybody else on the subject. Aloha, thanks for watching, happy gardening, and don't let your orchids hang loose. Make sure they're tied down well.